In 1998, the four largest tobacco companies in America agreed to pay more than $200 billion. Not because they wanted to, because they had been caught. Exposed for decades of lies about what their product actually did to the human body. But the truly wild part of this story is not the settlement, and it is not the lies. It is the fact that tobacco had been shaping human civilization for over 12,000 years before anyone even thought to ask whether it was dangerous. And by the time they did ask, it was already too late. To understand how we got here, we need to go way back, not centuries, millennia. In the high desert of what is now Utah, at a site archaeologists call the Wishbone Site, researchers uncovered something remarkable. Seeds of wild desert tobacco, sitting inside an ancient fireplace dating back roughly 12,300 years. That makes tobacco one of the oldest plants humans have ever deliberately used. Long before farming, long before cities, long before written language, people in the Americas were already drawn to this plant. The indigenous peoples of the Americas did not smoke tobacco the way we think of smoking today. For them, this was a sacred plant, a bridge between the physical world and the spiritual one. Shamans in the Peruvian and Ecuadorian Andes used tobacco in rituals going back at least 5,000 years. They believed the smoke carried prayers upward, that it could heal sickness, and that it connected the living with their ancestors. By around 8,000 years ago, something shifted. People were no longer just gathering wild tobacco. They were actively cultivating it, planting it, selecting for certain traits, breeding new varieties. Scientists can see this in the archaeological record through changes in seed size, leaf structure, and nicotine content. This was one of the earliest examples of deliberate agriculture in the Americas, and the crop they chose to domesticate was not corn or squash, it was tobacco. The Mayan civilization took tobacco use to another level around the year 470. Across the regions that are now Mexico, Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, and El Salvador, the Maya developed elaborate smoking ceremonies. Carved reliefs from Mayan temples show priests using smoking tubes during religious rites. At least two of their gods were depicted as smokers. Tobacco was not just a ritual tool for the Maya. They also believed it had medicinal properties, claiming it could cure toothaches and snake bites, and even clear the lungs. That last one aged particularly badly. As the Maya migrated northward into the Mississippi Valley, they carried their tobacco practices with them. Within a few centuries, smoking had spread to tribes as far north as Hudson Bay. The Algonquian peoples believed tobacco was a gift from the Great Spirit. The Iroquois had their own origin story for the plant, saying it first grew from the head of Attahensik after she died giving birth to her twin sons. Across the entire continent, from the tip of South America to the frozen reaches of Canada, tobacco was woven into the spiritual and social fabric of indigenous life. Then, in 1492, everything changed. When Christopher Columbus and his crew landed in the Caribbean, the native Taino people greeted them with gifts: fruit, food, spears, and bundles of dried brown leaves. Columbus had no idea what to do with them. He reportedly threw them overboard, but other members of his expedition watched the Taino people roll these dried leaves into tubes and light them on fire, breathing in the smoke. Two of Columbus's crew, Rodrigo de Jerez and Luis de Torres, tried it themselves while exploring Cuba. Rodrigo de Jerez became so fond of the habit that when he returned to Spain and walked the streets blowing smoke from his mouth and nose, the locals were terrified. They thought he was possessed by the devil, and the Spanish Inquisition actually threw him in prison for it. By the time he was released 7 years later, smoking had become popular across Spain. The Spanish were the first Europeans to recognize tobacco's commercial potential, and they quickly set up cultivation operations in the Caribbean. But it was a French diplomat who would accidentally give the plant its lasting identity. In 1560, Jean Nicot, the French ambassador to Portugal, obtained tobacco seeds and sent them to the French court. He promoted the plant as a miracle cure for headaches and other ailments. And his enthusiasm was so contagious that the plant's scientific name, Nicotiana, was named after him. So was nicotine, the chemical compound that would eventually hook billions of people. Jean Nicot had no idea what he was really unleashing. Within decades of Columbus's first encounter, tobacco had spread across the entire known world at a speed that may have been unmatched by any other agricultural product in history. Portuguese sailors planted it at trading outposts across the globe. By the mid-1500s, they were growing tobacco commercially in Brazil, and the crop quickly became a sought-after commodity in ports across Europe and the Americas. By the end of the 1500s, tobacco had reached virtually every country in Europe. From there, it spread to Africa, carried by French traders to the west coast and Portuguese merchants to the east. It reached the Ottoman Empire, where it became enormously popular despite attempts by sultans to ban it. It reached China, where by the 1600s it had become so widespread that officials were trying and failing to restrict its use. It reached Japan, India, and Southeast Asia, all within the span of a single human lifetime. The world had never seen anything spread this fast. Tobacco crossed every border, every culture, every religion. It did not matter whether a society was Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, or anything else. The plant found its way in. Not everyone was a fan. England's King James I published a famous rant in 1604 called A Counterblast to Tobacco, where he called smoking a barbarous custom and described it as hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. 3 years later, a group of English settlers would land in Virginia and prove that his opinion did not matter at all when money was involved. The Jamestown colony was a disaster. Founded in 1607 by the Virginia Company of London, it was supposed to generate profit for its investors. Instead, the colonists were dying. Disease, starvation, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy killed more than 80% of the settlers between 1607 and 1610. The survivors tried everything to find a profitable export: glass blowing, silk from silkworms, wine from vineyards. Nothing worked. Then John Rolfe showed up. Rolfe arrived in Virginia in May of 1610 after being shipwrecked in Bermuda for nearly a year. He was an avid smoker who understood the European demand for tobacco. The problem was that the native Virginia tobacco, a variety called Nicotiana rustica, tasted terrible to English smokers. It was bitter and harsh. The good stuff came from Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, and Spain guarded those seeds like state secrets. Somehow, Rolfe managed to get his hands on seeds of Nicotiana tabacum, the Spanish variety, likely from Trinidad or Venezuela. He planted them in Jamestown soil in 1612, and it worked. The Virginia climate and the rich bottomland soil produced tobacco that was smooth, sweet, and enormously popular in England. Rolfe had saved Jamestown. By 1617, the colony was exporting 20,000 pounds of tobacco to England. By 1627, that number had exploded to 500,000 pounds per year. Tobacco became so valuable in Virginia that colonists literally planted it in the streets of Jamestown. They planted it in cemeteries. They used it as currency. You could pay your taxes with tobacco. You could buy a wife with it. The Virginia Company offered land grants to anyone willing to come to the colony and grow the crop, and settlers poured in. But tobacco farming had a dark underside. The crop was brutally labor-intensive. Planting, tending, harvesting, and curing the leaves demanded constant attention throughout the entire year, and tobacco was ruthless on the soil, stripping it of nutrients within just 3 or 4 growing seasons. After that, the land was useless for years. This meant planters constantly needed 2 things: new land, which they took from indigenous peoples as they pushed further inland, and new workers, because there were never enough hands to keep up with the demand. At first, Virginia relied on indentured servants from England, poor men and women who traded years of their freedom for passage across the Atlantic. But indentured servants eventually earned their freedom, and the supply was never reliable. Beginning in 1619, when a ship carrying roughly 20 enslaved Africans arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia, planters found a different solution: enslaved labor. Tobacco did not just build the economy of colonial Virginia. It created the economic demand for the system of chattel slavery that would define and scar America for centuries to come. By the time of the American Revolution, Virginia was the wealthiest and most populous of the 13 colonies, and that wealth was built on tobacco, cultivated by enslaved people. The influence of tobacco extended far beyond the American South. In England, tobacco taxes became a critical source of government revenue. In Africa, tobacco was traded alongside other goods in the exchanges that fueled the transatlantic slave trade. In Asia, the plant spread with astonishing speed after Portuguese traders introduced it. By the early 1600s, a Chinese philosopher named Fang Yizi was already warning about the dangers of smoking. Nobody listened. The pattern of ignoring warnings about tobacco was established early and would continue for centuries. For the next 200 years, tobacco remained a luxury product. People smoked pipes, chewed tobacco, or snorted it as snuff. Cigars were popular among the wealthy. Cigarettes existed, but were hand-rolled, expensive, and relatively rare. In the Ottoman Empire, soldiers had started rolling tobacco in strips of newspaper during the Crimean War in the 1850s, and British soldiers who fought alongside them brought the habit home. But making cigarettes was slow work. A skilled worker could roll maybe 3,000 cigarettes in a 10-hour day, and the hand-rolling process kept prices high enough that cigarettes remained a niche product. The vast majority of tobacco consumption came from pipes, cigars, and chewing tobacco. That was about to change in a way nobody saw coming. In 1875, a tobacco company in Richmond, Virginia, called Allen and Ginter, offered a prize of $75,000 to anyone who could invent a machine capable of rolling cigarettes. A young man named James Albert Bonsack, the son of a Virginia textile mill owner, decided to give it a try. He was just 16 years old. He borrowed money from friends and $50 from his grandmother, dropped out of Roanoke College, and set up shop in his father's mill. By 1880, Bonsack had a working prototype. It was destroyed in a fire, so he built another one. This time he filed a patent. His machine could produce 120,000 cigarettes in 10 hours. That was the equivalent of 40 hand rollers working a full shift. Allen and Ginter, the company that had offered the prize, ordered a machine but then rejected it. They were afraid customers would look down on machine-made products, and they were also trying to avoid paying out that $75,000 prize. But a young tobacco entrepreneur from Durham, North Carolina, saw the opportunity that everyone else was missing. His name was James Buchanan Duke, and he was about to build a monopoly. Duke recognized something critical. He could not compete with the established smoking tobacco brands of his era. The pipe tobacco market was locked up, but cigarettes were different. Cigarettes were faster to smoke, easier to carry, and if you could make them cheap enough, you could sell them to everyone. In 1884, Duke struck a deal with Bonsack for exclusive use of the machines at a 25% discount below what any competitor would pay. He installed 4 machines in a New York City factory, surrounded by a massive population of immigrants who had arrived in a city of factories and tenements, where the quick nicotine hit of a cheap cigarette fit perfectly into a 10-minute break. Duke's labor costs collapsed. In 1876, making 1,000 cigarettes cost about 96 cents in labor. By 1895, the same 1,000 cigarettes cost about 8 cents. He poured the savings into aggressive advertising, blanketing the country with ads, coupons, and promotional cards. By 1889, Duke was the largest cigarette manufacturer in the United States. In 1890, he merged with 4 other major companies to form the American Tobacco Company, which controlled 90% of the cigarette market. It was one of the first great monopolies of the industrial age. The Supreme Court eventually broke up the American Tobacco Company in 1911 for violating antitrust laws, splitting it into the companies that would dominate the 20th century: R.J. Reynolds, Liggett Myers, Lorillard, Philip Morris, Brown, and Williamson. These names would become household words and, eventually, defendants in the largest civil litigation in American history. But in the early 1900s, cigarettes were just getting started. The real explosion came with the World Wars. During World War I, cigarettes were included in soldiers' rations. General John Pershing himself reportedly sent a telegram saying that tobacco was as important as food and ammunition. Cigarettes were practical for trench warfare in a way that other tobacco products simply were not. Unlike a pipe or cigar, a cigarette required no extra equipment, fit easily into a uniform pocket, and could be smoked quickly during a brief pause between shellings. Organizations like the YMCA and the Red Cross shipped millions of cigarettes to the front lines. Cigarettes became symbols of patriotic masculinity, and millions of young men came home from the war addicted to nicotine. World War II repeated the pattern on an even larger scale. President Roosevelt declared tobacco an essential wartime crop, and cigarette companies included free packs in military rations. Soldiers from small towns in Kansas and factory workers in Detroit alike came to associate the cigarette with camaraderie, stress relief, and survival. By the time the wars were over, smoking had become embedded in the culture at every level. The post-war period was the golden age of tobacco. Movie stars smoked on screen constantly, and Hollywood made cigarettes look glamorous and effortless. Doctors appeared in advertisements endorsing specific cigarette brands. Ads in medical journals featured slogans suggesting that a particular brand was easier on the throat or recommended by physicians. The tobacco industry spent millions on marketing campaigns that associated smoking with sophistication, independence, rebellion, and sex appeal. They sponsored television shows, sporting events, and cultural institutions. Cigarettes were everywhere, and questioning them felt almost unpatriotic. The numbers tell the story. In 1900, the average American smoked about 54 cigarettes per year. By 1963, that number had skyrocketed to 4,345 cigarettes per person per year. Nearly half of all American adults were smokers. The tobacco industry was pulling in billions of dollars annually, and it seemed like nothing could stop them. And then came the science. The first formal statistical evidence linking cigarettes to lung cancer was published in 1929 by Fritz Lichtendt, a German physician in Dresden. This research actually contributed to a strong anti-smoking movement in Nazi Germany, of all places. But the association with the Nazi regime tainted the research in the eyes of the rest of the world. The topic remained largely untouched for decades. In the early 1950s, two landmark studies changed everything. Ernst Winder and Evarts Graham published research showing a direct connection between smoking and lung cancer. In England, Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill launched the British Doctors Study, which tracked the smoking habits and health outcomes of over 40,000 physicians. The results were devastating and undeniable. But the tobacco industry was not about to let science destroy their business without a fight. In 1953, the chief executives of the major tobacco companies met at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. They hired a public relations firm called Hill and Knowlton, and together they crafted a strategy that would become one of the most effective disinformation campaigns in corporate history. The plan was simple. They would not argue that smoking was safe. They would argue that the science was uncertain. They would manufacture doubt. The tobacco companies created the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, later renamed the Council for Tobacco Research, which sounded like a legitimate scientific organization, but existed primarily to fund studies that would muddy the waters. They hired scientists to question the methodology of studies linking smoking to cancer. They released statements saying the evidence was inconclusive. They spent decades telling the American public that the question of whether smoking caused cancer was still an open question, even as their own internal research confirmed exactly what the independent scientists were saying. Internal memos that emerged years later revealed the depth of the deception. Tobacco companies knew nicotine was addictive. They knew cigarettes caused cancer. They knew this, and they suppressed it, while simultaneously spending billions to convince new customers, including teenagers, to start smoking. On January 11, 1964, United States Surgeon General Luther Terry held a press conference on a Saturday morning. He chose a Saturday deliberately, so the stock market would be closed by the time the news hit. His report, titled "Smoking and Health," was 150,000 words long and concluded that cigarette smoking was a direct cause of lung cancer in men and a major contributor to heart disease, chronic bronchitis, and emphysema. The committee found that smokers were 70% more likely to die of a heart attack than non-smokers. At the time, 42% of American adults smoked. The report shocked the country. But it did not stop the tobacco industry, not even close. In the years following the Surgeon General's report, Congress passed the Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act of 1965, which eventually required warning labels on cigarette packages. A ban on television and radio advertising of cigarettes went into effect in 1970. But the tobacco industry adapted. They poured even more money into lobbying Congress. They targeted women and minorities with specialized marketing campaigns. They expanded aggressively into international markets, particularly in developing countries where regulations were weaker and populations were less informed about the health risks. For decades, the tobacco companies successfully defended themselves against every lawsuit brought by dying smokers and their families, arguing that the warning labels on their products were sufficient and that individuals had chosen to smoke of their own free will. But in the 1990s, the walls finally began to close in. In 1994, internal industry documents began leaking to the public. These were not rumors or speculation. These were the tobacco company's own memos, research papers, and strategic plans. They showed that the companies had known for decades that nicotine was addictive and that smoking caused cancer. They showed deliberate strategies to target children and teenagers. They showed that the entire public relations campaign of doubt and uncertainty had been manufactured from the beginning. State attorneys general, led by Mississippi's Mike Moore, began filing lawsuits to recover the billions of dollars their states had spent treating smoking-related illnesses through Medicaid. Moore's argument was straightforward. You caused this health crisis. You pay for it. In November of 1998, the four largest tobacco companies, Philip Morris, R.J., Reynolds, Brown and Williamson, and Lorillard, signed what became known as the Master Settlement Agreement. It was the largest civil litigation settlement in American history. The companies agreed to pay the states at least $206 billion over 25 years. They agreed to disband the Tobacco Institute and the Council for Tobacco Research, the organizations that had been central to their disinformation campaigns. They agreed to eliminate billboard and transit advertising, ban cartoon characters like Joe Camel from their marketing, and stop targeting minors. The settlement also required the tobacco companies to make millions of their internal documents available to the public. Those 14 million pages are now archived at the University of California, San Francisco, and they remain one of the most damning records of corporate deception ever assembled. The impact was real. Between 1998 and 2019, cigarette consumption in the United States dropped by more than 50%. Smoking among high schoolers fell from about 36% in 1997 to around 6% in 2019. The anti-smoking campaigns funded by the settlement, particularly through the Truth Initiative, helped shift public perception dramatically. But the story of tobacco is not over, not even close. The tobacco industry did not simply accept defeat. They adapted, the way they always have. Major tobacco companies diversified their portfolios, buying food companies, investing in pharmaceutical firms, and quietly positioning themselves for whatever came next. Philip Morris even renamed its parent company to Altria Group in 2003, a corporate rebrand designed to distance the company from the toxic associations of its most famous product. And then came vaping. The concept of an electronic cigarette was actually patented back in 1930 by an American inventor named Joseph Robinson. But the idea sat dormant for decades. It was not until 2003 that a Chinese pharmacist named Hon Lik, whose father had died of lung cancer, developed the first commercially viable e-cigarette. The devices reached the American market in 2006, and within a few years, they had created an entirely new industry. Juul, which launched in 2015, dominated the market with sleek, USB-shaped devices and flavors like mango and creme brulee that critics said were clearly designed to appeal to teenagers. By 2024, approximately 1.63 million American middle and high school students were using e-cigarettes, and nearly 88% of them used flavored products. The same cycle that played out with traditional cigarettes, the targeting of young people, the sleek marketing, the downplaying of health risks, was happening again in real time. Only the delivery mechanism had changed. The addictive chemical at the center of it all was still nicotine. When you zoom out and look at the full arc of this story, from those ancient fireplace seeds in the Utah desert 12,000 years ago to the vape pens in high school bathrooms today, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. Tobacco has been one of the most consequential plants in human history. It funded colonies, built empires, enslaved millions, created fortunes, corrupted science, killed hundreds of millions of people, and it is still going. The World Health Organization estimates that tobacco kills more than 8 million people every year globally. That is more than HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. It remains the leading cause of preventable death in the United States and in most of the developed world. Think about that for a second. We have known for over 60 years that this product kills the people who use it. We have fought wars over it, built nations on it, and spent centuries arguing about it. And we still have not stopped it. A sacred plant that indigenous peoples used to connect with their gods became a tool of colonial exploitation, an engine of industrial wealth, and eventually a weapon of mass addiction. The tobacco industry lied about the science for decades, paid hundreds of billions in settlements, watched their customers die by the millions, and then figured out a way to sell nicotine to a new generation through a different device. The names changed, the chemistry did not. And the most unsettling part might be that even after everything we know, after the Surgeon General reports, after the lawsuits, after the $200 billion settlement, after the mountains of dead, the industry found a way to reinvent itself and start the cycle again. The question is whether this time we will catch it sooner. If you made it this far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next one. Drop a like if you learned something new today, and leave a comment telling me what part of this story surprised you the most.